Thanks a lot. Sorry for being delayed. Me and Euclid were joking that I was going to blame him for being late because he's a Greek and I'm Irish, but I will take the blame. I think just to start, what I'm going to focus on is more on the side of the political alternatives as opposed to the social resistance. A few remarks about social resistance at the end. It's not because I don't think the social resistance is important. In fact, it's a precondition for the political alternatives is developing the social resistance, and in turn developing the social resistance will aid, develop, give colour to our political alternatives. But it's just a choice to focus on one aspect of this discussion. Thanks to everyone involved, but Helena in particular, and Transform for organising this. I think there's a real benefit to having these discussions. I obviously get more, as an MEP in the left, I get more access to these kind of discussions than most people, and I find them enormously helpful to share experiences from the different countries affected by the Troika. They use countries as laboratories to pursue certain policies that are then extended to others. And in turn, we can use our experiences of resistance and trying to develop it, obviously not in a carbon copy. And I agree with the last speaker about the absolutely essential nature of developing European resistance, taking into account the different national features, the fact that struggles happen on a national plane, etc. Just to start, the topic of the whole meeting is challenging the rule of Troika. Obviously, formally speaking, the rule of Troika has ended in Ireland, and I want to deal with that for a moment because it's the latest phase in the myth of Ireland being the success story. So that's been gone the whole way through the crisis, with Ireland being used as the good piggy to beat the bad piggies of Portugal, of Spain, of Greece, etc., of Cyprus. And obviously it's a lie, and those who are here not from Ireland, I'm sure, have already heard many examples of how that's a lie, as in people didn't accept it, there was opposition, there wasn't sufficient movements, but it didn't indicate an acceptance of these policies, but also the fact that they haven't worked from the point of view of the majority of society. They've worked from the point of view of the bondholders, big business, etc., and which is obviously what they were aimed to do. But just in terms of the Troika leaving, I have a paper that I will distribute in whatever way I can, Bailout Exit, a Return to Sovereignty, or Troika Rule by another name, because I think it's important just to have both the economic but also the legal facts about the reality of the continuation of Troika rule, because in no sense has Troika rule ended in Ireland. Ireland is still in a very similar situation to the other countries under the Troika. One, we will have a continuation of austerity budgets for years to come. The government at the moment in Ireland is talking about tax cuts. We're talking about tax cuts for the richest 30% of income tax earners. At the same time, they're not mentioning that they already have penciled in €2 billion worth of tax cuts, €2 billion worth of extra austerity in the next budget, and so any tax cuts that are made will have to be compensated with extra austerity on top of that. So we have a continuation of austerity for years. We also have a continuation of supervision of all of the Troika agencies. The Commission, the IMF, the ECB, they're going to be here for decades. They're continuing to have offices to monitor everything. You have post-programme surveillance of two different sorts, by the Commission and by the IMF in particular. And the result is that, in effect, the visits, the men in black, the suits, they will continue with the same demands upon governments and advice for governments and so on. And the third point, and it applies to all countries in Europe, but in particular those in the so-called excessive deficit procedure, is that with the six-pack, with the two-pack, with the fiscal treaty, they've got all the rules they want in terms of having hammered in neoliberal austerity policies in law. That's, in many ways, it supplants and replaces the more brutal, blunt mechanism of the Troika, is just to put it into law and to say that's the only law there has. And it is quite a transformation that has taken place in terms of the way budgets are now written at a European level and the role of the European Commission in particular in that. And then the last point to make is we shouldn't forget that there can still be a second bailout for Ireland. You can have a resurgence of the banking crisis. It's certainly a possibility in the second half of this year after they get the elections out of the way, and you could even have a return to Troika rule proper. I don't think at this stage it's the most likely scenario, but if the Greek crisis redevelops, as is likely, and you have another wave going, then Ireland is not out of the woods at all. What I want to talk about is what's a real left exit strategy from the Troika dictatorship and from the crisis. How do you popularize, how do you win support for such an alternative? We're 6 years into the crisis. It is now very clear, I'm sure the point has been made by many people, that this isn't some minor blip of capitalism. It's a very serious crisis of the capitalist system. I think you can look at the crisis, and in Ireland there's many different layers upon which, or different kind of fields upon which the crisis plays out, and different aspects of the crisis at different levels. And I agree with the last speaker in terms of the fundamentals of the global crisis are rooted in 70s, decline of profitability. I think you can have a debate, which we're having in our organisation, about the tendency of the rate of profit to fall and how central that is to decline in profitability. But it's irrefutable that you had a decline in profitability in the 70s, and then coping mechanisms of capitalism, neoliberalism, debt, and we're paying the price for those coping mechanisms for a previous crisis now. That's central, and it's why it's not just some small blip. It's why it continues. It's so deep, it's so protracted, is that it's a very deep crisis of capitalism rooted in those contradictions. Secondly, you definitely have a particular European crisis. The world crisis, those features exist within Europe, but you also have a particular crisis of the process of capitalist integration of Europe. Because it is a capitalist integration process that we have. It's an unfinished integration process, but it's driven by capital interest from the very start, in my opinion. And there's major contradictions, and they were papered over initially with the euro. The euro helped to paper over the contradictions, the lack of development of parts of Europe, the uneven development of European capitalism. But actually now they're exposed, and the eurozone and the euro plays a role in actually exacerbating those tensions between the north and the south, even between the capitalist classes, although they're not very prominent at the moment. And then in Ireland we have our own crisis, and it's a crisis, many different aspects of the crisis, but partly it's a crisis of the developmental model of the Irish capitalist class. The Irish capitalist class, for those not from Ireland, is a particularly pathetic, craven, crap capitalist class. They don't, produce stuff, sell it on the world market by and large. They are, a comprador bourgeoisie that sells itself to the highest bidder. And in Ireland, the model of development that the Irish political elite went for is an aircraft model. We're going to invite US multinationals in particular into Ireland. We're going to offer them highly educated workforce, relatively speaking low paid workforce compared to the level of education. We're going to offer them to pay basically no taxes, not just on the stuff they make in Ireland, but all the stuff they make around the world. They can use Ireland, and then hope to get a developmental boost from that, which worked for a period of time in an extremely imbalanced way, which we saw in the first phase of the Celtic Tiger. But that model is finished, it's over, it's still all they have, because that's what they're talking about going back to. It's why they're so protective of their corporate tax rate. But in the context of an enlarged European Union, with countries in the East that are able to offer cheaper labour, able to offer lower corporation tax rates, it doesn't exist as a way forward anymore. And you have a crisis of that model of the development of Ireland as an economy, and no alternative strategy. You just have internal devaluation, export our way into what? Destroying the domestic market. But that's what they have. And so I think you have a world, European and Irish crisis, and similarly you could say, I'm sure the comrades from the different countries can do the same for their countries. The response of capitalism, obviously it's summed up in the nice clinical term austerity. Austerity is a weapon to take advantage of the crisis from the point of view of the capitalist class, and ultimately to try to resolve the crisis on the basis of restoring profitability on the back of the working class. That's what austerity ultimately is about, in my opinion. And it manifests itself in two ways, and I think we talk a lot about the first way, generally amongst the public, and not enough about the second way. The first way is the notion of us paying for their crisis, right? Which is, it's very, very good that that's a popular notion that's out there, and it's accurate. And in Ireland and in the other countries, you can literally identify the us paying for the crisis, as in last year between the state paying bondholders and bailed out banks paying bondholders, 26 billion euros left the state to pay bondholders. It's us literally paying for the crisis of a section of capitalism, of finance capital. That's a multiple of the deficit on a yearly basis, which is 11, 12 billion is going to be, with last year will be less than that this year. That's the most obvious expression of us paying for their crisis. But the other thing that I think we have to talk about more is the idea of them using the crisis as opportunity for the capitalist class, and the extent to which, I mean, it's not that they set out to create this crisis, they didn't want this crisis, it's a crisis of their system, but now that it's here, they're determined to get every ounce of benefit from it and to strengthen their class position relative to the position of the working class in the various countries in Europe. And it happens on many different fronts: political, economic, social, and you see it. I mean, I always talk about it. It's the classic Naomi Klein shock doctrine of using the crisis to take advantage of from their point of view. You see it in most brutal economic figures in terms of the class war, in terms of unit labour costs, the doctrine of internal devaluation. That's the class war dressed up in economic language. Unit labour costs in Ireland are down maybe 13%, more than that in Greece, slightly more than that in Spain and Portugal, I think. They have had an effect on driving down wage costs quite successfully from the point of view of the Irish capitalist class. You obviously have an attack on trade union rights. We've seen what's happened in Greece in terms of mobilisation orders for seamen, for metro workers. Even in Ireland, you had talk about that kind of thing with the talk about an ESB strike, a strike of electricity workers. The pushing of privatisation. Obviously, water charges in Ireland are a part of that, and all the countries of the memorandum, you have privatisation of water as a particularly prominent thing, but also privatisation of other assets. And so that's like a strategic goal that the capitalist class has, is to divest themselves of responsibility of paying for stuff in terms of taxation to pay for services, but also to open up new markets to commodify new things, water in this case. That's a strategic goal. But also, so there's many examples of this economic war that takes place, trade union rights, etc., all of that. But the other thing that, again, I don't think we pay enough attention to is on the political plane, the way this is taking place. Things like the six-pack, the two-pack, the fiscal treaty, they actually are important. I know they're technical, people don't necessarily know everything that's in them or whatever, but what they represent is a shifting of power from elected governments to unelected bureaucrats in the European Commission and the European Central Bank. And we're no defenders of the elected governments across Europe. They're all right-wing governments, whether they call themselves socialist or social democratic, or they call themselves conservative or popular or whatever. But there's a reason for them doing it, and it's like a long-term vision, but it's also right now, is that it's easier for movements to develop and put pressure on governments who have to face elections and force them to make concessions than it is to put pressure on someone like the European Commission or the European Central Bank. If there's a general strike in one country, what does the European Commission really care? I think they can be forced to care, you can develop such a movement, but that's the idea, that's the strategy behind it. You have like quite fundamental attacks on people's democratic rights, a constitutionalisation of neoliberalism, a constitutionalisation of austerity, the kind of stuff that Maggie Thatcher would have dreamt of is now being implemented at a European level, and it does have consequences in terms of the class struggle. And all of that is having an impact in terms of raising profitability. Profits have increased across Europe. In Ireland, they've increased dramatically. They're up 21% since before the crisis. They're up 50% since the lowest point in the crisis. Those figures are a bit distorted because of the nature of everyone running their profits through Ireland, but in terms of comparing them to each other, they have a certain validity. So that's their strategy. I think that there is a point about the nature of the crisis, how deep the crisis is that, and this is like central for the rest of the argument I'm going to make, is that there isn't a whole lot of room for negotiation or compromise with the capitalist class in Europe at this stage. And I think that's empirically proven by what happened in Cyprus. They aren't really, there may be some space, and I think that there can be space if you mobilise enough people. Anyone, even the most right-wing government, the most right-wing commission can be forced to give some reforms. But the space is narrow enough because of the very deep nature of the crisis, and because then they're committed to using the crisis in their own interests in terms of driving of austerity. And so what we would say is that, generally speaking, we have agreement here, they're not people who can be reasoned with. You can't persuade them by the logic, the economic logic in terms of the impact on society as a whole. Because also a factor, not the only factor, but is, you have to look at the extent to which that sector of capital, which is the banks, the bondholders, finance capital, has political power at this stage. Not to the exclusion of manufacturing capital, but it has more influence than at many stages of the past. And you see that in terms of the attitude to debt write-downs or whatever. You look at the attitude of the IMF, which takes a more global picture from the interests of capitalism as a whole, and they're interested in capitalism keeping going, versus Merkel, which is not interested in any write-downs, etc. And it's because Merkel and the Commission are very, very close to finance capital in particular, and those interests are being pursued. And so we don't think there's a whole lot of room of negotiation. And I agree with with two speakers ago, the point about the matrix, the tablet, etc. I think that's bang on. I mean, any government of the left, in any country in Europe, but let's take the example of Ireland, will be faced with two roads. One road will basically result in the acceptance of the memorandum, the acceptance of the debt, the acceptance of austerity, and it leads to mass disillusion, opportunities for the far right, etc. That's one clear road that exists. Obviously, the Social Democrats go down that road every single day of the week. But for us, in terms of the left, there is another road. But I think we've got to recognise it's a difficult road, and it's a road that leads to a very, very significant struggle. And the starting point of that road, in my opinion, is repudiation of the debt, the tearing up of the memorandum, the breaking all of the rules of the six-pack, of the two-pack, of the EU, and breaking the rules of the Eurozone. And where does that road lead? In my opinion, not necessarily immediately. I'm not saying you've got immediately the question of power in terms of working class power or socialist change is posed right there and then in terms of a left government being elected. I think there can be a period whereby a struggle is taking place, a left government exists, etc. But it does point in the direction of who rules society. It points in the direction of a struggle about, does the capitalist class maintain in control, or the question of working class people ruling, the question of socialist change. That's fundamentally where that road leads, in my opinion. We think that therefore you have to popularise the socialist alternative. I don't just mean going on the street and saying socialism, 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 or making sure we pepper all our speeches with socialism, but trying to re-win in a real way, which doesn't exist in, I'd say, every country in Europe, the notion of an alternative way of organising the economy, the notion of a breaking up of the capitalist state, a reorganisation of society on a democratic basis, planning the economy, etc. That's like a very, very big task we have ahead of ourselves, and because the crisis is such, the battle is such, that these choices are going to be posed, and we're going to have to popularise and try and win support for that idea. How do we do that? In my opinion, it does mean mentioning socialism and arguing for socialism and trying to, in the moments you get on TV or whatever, to give people a vision of, okay, a different way of organising society. But it also means picking out certain key central socialist demands that point to, if we reorganise society, you could meet people's needs. Because there's so many of people's needs that people are clear, people know they can't be met by the way society is currently organised. Those key ones, just running through them quickly. Repudiation of the debt. I mean, the way we pose the programme here, we do say establish a debt audit commission, etc., etc. But then we say repudiate the debt, because that's the point, is that we can't pay it, and we can call it odious and then not pay it. I think that's what we should do, but the debt is unpayable in many of the countries of the periphery. It's not our debt, we shouldn't have to pay it, etc., etc. We know the arguments behind it, but it's central. It's a central part of the crisis, the central weapon of the capitalist class in the north relative to the working class in the south. So I think that's absolutely central. Second thing is to point to, and I think we don't do it enough, the collapse of investment by the capitalist class. The collapse of investment at a European level since the crisis is 4 times the total collapse in GDP. It's 12 times the collapse in consumer spending. And so when they say it's our crisis, it's all in us together, it's their crisis. But it points to an inability of the capitalist class to generate employment. If they're not going to invest, well, then they're not going to generate. And so the centrality of public investment programs paid for through millionaires tax, income tax, corporation tax, to create jobs, to try and help redevelop the economy. Thirdly, rejecting the dictatorship of the financial markets and the banks, arguing that they should be run as public utilities, democratically controlled, use them instead of running society in the service of the banks, run the banks and the financial markets in the service of society. I think we can definitely win that argument with people. And then fourthly, getting to the fundamental points about socialism, is saying to people, and I think the investment thing, it helps our argument, is that we can't really afford a system whereby the capitalists decide to invest, not to invest. People are employed, not employed, have to emigrate based on their decisions of profitability. And even though profits are going up, they still decide to hoard. And the hoarding of wealth in Europe at the moment is immense by the capitalist class. There's more cash in banks in Europe at any stage previously. And so, therefore, saying we need public ownership, democratic control of the key sections of the economy. We need to develop a plan. Obviously, they're like headline points, and it's just, from the point of view of someone sitting at home listening to that, it's kind of jargon. You have to go into it, you have to explain what that means. But that idea of popularising the idea of planning, and in that way a plan to get out of the crisis, to exit. Just the last point I will make is on the question of the euro. I think it can't be avoided. I think it's now central to the European debate. I think a starting point is to say very clearly whatever your position at the end is, and I think there's grounds for people to take different positions they take, but you have to say the euro is not some sort of neutral currency. The euro is a weapon of the capitalist class in Europe. That's, from its very construction, that's the purpose of it. Maastricht, etc. It was like a forerunner to the six-pack, to the two-pack. It was about embedding neoliberal policies across Europe with the debt, the GDP targets, with the deficit targets, etc. It is a weapon of class war. That's the reality. And the European Central Bank in particular, and the position the European Central Bank got, the way the central bank was established, that's all part of that weapon, the way inflation, etc., etc. But secondly, it's a weapon right now is a weapon of fear. That if you defy the Troika, you're out of the euro, and then you got a disaster. Particularly, it's all the countries of the periphery, which don't have strong economies. The idea in Ireland of people going back to the punt, it's not a very attractive proposition for people. And so, in my opinion, a lot of people pose the question wrong on both sides, and it's like, are you for or against the euro? For me, the point is, are you for or against the model of organising society as we currently have it, which is called capitalism? And are you in favour of a different way of organising it, which in my opinion is called socialism? And then, if you elect a left government, I think then, to be honest, I think you'll be out of the euro. I think that's what's going to happen. I don't think they're going to... There are circumstances where I could see it, but I don't think it's most likely. So outside of the euro, on the base of capitalism, not an answer for people. It's just another way of putting the crisis onto working class people through devaluation, etc. But on the basis of implementing socialist policies, it's likely you'll be out of the euro, but that's not the end of the world. If you impose capital controls, if you nationalise the banks, if you have a plan to restart production, etc., then in that context of workers' control, a national currency could be a tool to be used in terms of redeveloping the economy. Final point is there isn't a national solution to the crisis. It has to be, I agree with the last speaker, there has to be a European solution to the crisis. The road to that European alternative, a socialist Europe or whatever you want to call it, is not through this European Union. It'll be built on really the skeleton, on the bones of this European Union, but it has to be built. And it's built right here and now in terms of developing struggle, because it's the only way we can do it, is develop struggle as much as possible against all the attacks that are going on, but also then one country going, breaking with the rules, saying no, have a, like that guy Sotiris said, it'll have a dynamic effect across Europe and will pose the question of similar change in other countries. And we have to have that vision, and a vision of a fundamentally different type of Europe. I could see it. You could see a number of countries of the periphery breaking, going for a different model, struggling towards socialist change, and establishing some sort of federation of the periphery or the south or whatever, but it has to be with a vision of fundamental change, socialist change across Europe. Thanks.